On the morning of December 7th, 2009, Susan Cox Powell did not show up for work. That alone would not have been extraordinary. Winter storms were common in Utah. Schedules slipped, but Susan was meticulous, especially after becoming a mother. By mid-morning, concern hardened into alarm. Calls went unanswered. Her house in West Valley City was locked. Inside, nothing looked violently disturbed. There were no shattered windows, no blood, no signs of a struggle. And yet Susan was gone. Her husband, Josh Powell, offered an explanation that sounded thin the moment it left his mouth. He told police that the night before, despite freezing temperatures and fresh snow, he had taken Susan and their two young sons, Charlie, 4, and Braden, 2, on a spontaneous midnight camping trip into the desert. He said Susan stayed behind when they returned. He could not say where she was. The story was not merely odd. It was implausible. No campsite was named. No gear accounted for. No one could confirm seeing them. The boys, bundled and half asleep, could not meaningfully corroborate anything. From the outset, the investigation moved with a sense of wrongness that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Officers noted Josh's flat affect, his resistance to basic questions, the way his answers shifted when pressed. He consented to some searches and refused others. He invoked a lawyer quickly. None of that was illegal. All of it raised suspicion. Susan Powell, as friends and family described her, had been living under a low, constant pressure. She was a convert to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a woman who had tried to build a stable life within a marriage that had grown cold and controlling. She kept journals. She wrote carefully, sometimes obliquely, about her fears. She told friends she worried Josh might harm her. These were not dramatic declarations. They were the quiet notes of someone trying to be believed without sounding hysterical. In the days after her disappearance, police scoured the Powell home. They seized computers, phones, and Josh's minivan. Cadaver dogs alerted to the vehicle. The alerts did not prove a crime had occurred, but they narrowed the air in the room. Investigators followed tire tracks into remote areas. They traced Josh's movements through gas receipts and cell phone pings. The terrain was vast. Winter had already erased traces, and time worked against them. Without a body, every inference had to be earned inch by inch. Josh's behavior did not soften with scrutiny. He returned to work briefly, then withdrew. He resisted interviews. He seemed more concerned with asserting his rights than with finding his wife. This, too, was not evidence. It was context. The case was quickly trapped in that space where suspicion grows faster than proof. Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, arrived in Utah and pressed for answers. They found themselves navigating a system that moves deliberately by design. Police cannot arrest a person for being strange or cold. They cannot prosecute a theory. They need facts that survive courtrooms. The Coxes brought Susan's journals to light. They spoke publicly about her fears. They begged for urgency. They learned, painfully, how much of justice depends on what can be shown rather than what can be known. As days turned into weeks, the timeline hardened. Susan was last seen alive at home on December 6th. There were no confirmed sightings after that. Her personal effects purse, phone were missing. Her bank activities stopped. The silence grew louder. Each unreturned call became its own small indictment of the night she vanished. The children complicated everything. Charlie, old enough to speak, made comments that unsettled adults. He talked about his mother being in the trunk. He described seeing her sleeping. Such statements could not be treated as testimony. Children repeat, misinterpret, imagine, but they landed with a weight that would not lift. Social workers listened. Police documented. No one could convert a child's fragmentary words into a charge. Josh moved the family out of Utah not long after, relocating to Washington State with the boys. It was a legal move, and it widened the geographic and emotional distance between Susan's family and the investigation. Jurisdictional lines multiplied. So did delays. The sense that time was being lost, irreplaceable time, became its own form of grief. Behind the scenes, investigators found more pieces that did not fit comfortably into innocence. Josh had taken out a life insurance policy on Susan. He had written and recorded videos that read like farewells created before her disappearance. He distributed assets. He spoke of death abstractly, rehearsing it. None of this was a confession. All of it suggested preparation. The public watched a familiar pattern unfold: a missing woman, a husband who would not help, a case stalled by the absence of a body. What made this different was the accumulation of warning signs that seemed, in retrospect, too clear to ignore. Yet at the time, each sign stood alone, insufficient to carry the weight of an arrest. By early 2010, Susan Powell's case had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Searches were conducted and concluded. Leads surfaced and evaporated. Press conferences promised diligence. The family lived between hope and dread. Every winter storm that passed over the deserts of Utah felt like another erasure. The night Susan disappeared did not announce itself with chaos. There was number 911 call, no neighbor awakened by shouting. It was ordinary, which is part of what made it devastating. The absence of spectacle became the crime's greatest shield. And in that quiet, a story took hold, one that would test the limits of evidence, patience, and the idea that warning signs, however numerous, must still wait their turn to be believed. By the spring of 2010, the Susan Powell investigation had hardened into a paradox. Nearly everyone involved believed Josh Powell had killed his wife, yet no mechanism existed to force the truth into daylight. Detectives spoke cautiously in public, but their private focus rarely wavered. Josh remained the only viable suspect. The problem was not direction. It was gravity. Without a body, the case could not cross the threshold from suspicion to prosecution. Police continued to build a circumstantial case, brick by fragile brick. They reconstructed Josh's movements on the night Susan disappeared, mapping cell phone pings that placed him driving long distances into sparsely populated areas. They examined his finances, noting unusual purchases and withdrawals. They analyzed the contents of his computers, uncovering searches related to disposal and remote locations. Each finding tightened the circle, but none closed it. Josh responded by narrowing his own world. He avoided interviews, communicated through attorneys, and framed every request for cooperation as harassment. To some observers, this was the posture of a guilty man. To others, it was the behavior of someone who knew how easily appearances can be misread. The law allowed him to remain silent. The law, at this stage, protected him. Susan's parents watched this stalemate with growing anger and despair. They pushed for renewed searches, for charges, for anything that might prevent the case from fading into the archive of unsolved disappearances. They spoke to reporters, not out of a desire for attention, but out of fear that silence would bury their daughter as surely as the desert might have. Each interview was an attempt to keep Susan present in a system that seemed designed to move on. In Washington State, Josh tried to construct a new normal for his sons. He enrolled them in school. He kept them close. The boys became unintentionally the most volatile evidence in the case. Their statements to teachers and social workers continued to raise alarms. Charlie, in particular, described events in ways that suggested he had seen something terrible. Professionals documented these remarks carefully, aware that children's words can both illuminate and mislead. The responsibility was immense. To overinterpret was dangerous. To underreact felt worse. Child Protective Services began to scrutinize Josh's parenting. The concerns were not limited to Susan's disappearance. Josh was controlling, isolating, prone to erratic behavior. Supervised visits were eventually imposed when he was allowed to see the boys. These measures were protective, not punitive. Still, they escalated tensions. Josh viewed them as an attack, another attempt to paint him as a monster without proof. Meanwhile, investigators uncovered more of Susan's own voice. Her journals, once private, now read like a slow warning flare. She wrote about fear, about feeling trapped, about worries that something would happen to her, and that no one would believe it mattered. In one entry, she made clear arrangements for the care of her children should she die, expressing concern that Josh not be left in control. The language was restrained, but the implication was unmistakable. Susan was not writing fiction. She was documenting a threat she felt but could not escape. Josh's father, Susan Powell, entered the narrative in disturbing ways. He had been obsessively fixated on Susan, keeping journals of his own that veered into delusion. He became a suspect of a different kind, not for Susan's disappearance, but for the toxic environment surrounding her marriage. When police later arrested Stephen on unrelated charges involving voyeurism and child pornography, the revelation added another layer of revulsion to an already fraught case. It also complicated public perception, threatening to blur responsibility across generations rather than concentrate it where evidence pointed. Through all of this, the central fact remained unchanged. Susan Powell was missing, presumed dead, but legally absent. Prosecutors reviewed the case repeatedly and reached the same conclusion. They could not prove homicide beyond a reasonable doubt. They could not place Susan's body anywhere. They could not establish a precise cause of death. Any trial would risk acquittal, and an acquittal would end the possibility of future charges forever. The injustice of that calculation was not lost on Susan's family. They understood the law. They also understood what it felt like to watch it fail them. Every delay felt like complicity. Every procedural safeguard felt like another door closing. Public interest surged and ebbed. True crime forums dissected the case. Commentators argued over Josh's guilt with certainty that the courtroom could not share. This gap between public conviction and legal restraint widened, breeding cynicism. If so many signs could point in one direction and still mean nothing, what did justice actually require? By 2011, the investigation was no longer just about finding Susan. It had become a race against a different clock. Authorities worried increasingly about the safety of the children. Josh's mental state appeared to be deteriorating. His isolation deepened. He ranted about conspiracies, about being persecuted. Each report added urgency, but urgency without leverage remained inert. The Powell case settled into a grim holding pattern. Police waited for a break that never came. Social workers tried to balance parental rights against mounting risk. Susan's parents marked time with anniversaries, each one a reminder that their daughter's absence had become normalized by bureaucracy. What made the situation unbearable was the sense that the system could see the cliff edge, but could not legally step away from it. Everyone involved seemed to understand that something terrible had already happened and that something else might still happen. Yet no rule, no statute, no burden of proof allowed decisive action. In this suspended state, justice did not merely stall, it decayed. And as months passed, the question was no longer whether Susan Powell would be found, but whether the consequences of inaction would claim more lives before the truth could ever be forced into the open. By early 2012, the Susan Powell case had become less a traditional investigation than a slow-burning warning. The signals were everywhere, scattered across journals, videos, social service reports, and the strained testimonies of people who sensed a catastrophe forming but could not legally name it. The system was no longer merely waiting for evidence. It was absorbing risk day after day, hoping containment would be enough. Josh Powell's behavior continued to deteriorate. He was unemployed, increasingly isolated, and openly hostile toward anyone he believed aligned with Susan's family or law enforcement. His communications were laced with paranoia. He spoke of being framed, of persecution, of enemies. Friends drifted away. Relatives struggled to intervene. Each withdrawal tightened the pressure around him, and around the children who lived within that pressure. The boys remained under supervised visitation, a compromise meant to preserve parental rights while mitigating danger. These visits were short, structured, and monitored by social workers trained to detect harm. Yet, even within this controlled setting, unease persisted. Josh resisted rules, challenged authority, and fixated on grievances rather than on his son's well-being. The supervision was not a sign of trust. It was a measure of fear. At the same time, Susan's voice grew louder in absence. Her journals were now widely known, their contents difficult to read without a sense of guilt on behalf of institutions that had encountered her while she was alive. She had not been invisible. She had sought counseling. She had confided in friends. She had documented her fears. But fear, unless paired with a specific crime, carries little weight in a court of law. The realization was brutal. Susan had done almost everything a cautious person could do, and it had not been enough. Josh's own recordings surfaced more fully during this period, and they were deeply unsettling. In one video made months before Susan vanished, he spoke calmly about death, about distributing his belongings, about how people should remember him. The tone was not overtly violent. That was precisely what made it alarming. It sounded like rehearsal, like someone organizing the aftermath of something he expected to happen. Investigators viewed these materials with a mix of frustration and dread. They reinforced the narrative of premeditation, but still stopped short of proof. There was no admission of guilt, no direct reference to Susan's fate. The law remained unmoved. The children, too young to understand the scale of what surrounded them, continued to say things that haunted adults. Charlie's comments, recorded and analyzed repeatedly, suggested memory rather than imagination. Yet memory alone, especially from a child, could not anchor a homicide charge. Instead, it became part of a larger assessment, not of past crime, but of future danger. That assessment reached a critical point in early February 2012. A court hearing loomed, one that could permanently sever Josh's access to his sons. For Susan's parents, this was a rare moment of guarded hope. They believed that even if justice for their daughter remained unreachable, at least her children might be spared further harm. The hearing represented a boundary the system was finally prepared to enforce. Josh understood this as well. In the days leading up to the scheduled hearing, his communications took on a finality that was difficult to ignore in retrospect. He spoke of betrayal, of being stripped of everything that mattered, of living in a world that had already judged him. These statements, again, were not crimes. They were warnings that did not quite meet the threshold of intervention. On February 5th, 2012, a routine supervised visitation was arranged at Josh's rental house in Graham, Washington. A social worker drove Charlie and Braden there, following established protocol. The visit was meant to be brief. There was no indication in policy or precedent that it would be different from those that came before. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Josh met the social worker at the door. He appeared agitated. Without warning, he grabbed his sons, forced them inside, and slammed the door shut. The social worker heard shouting. She tried to force entry. She called 911. Inside the house, the system's long delay reached its irreversible conclusion. Josh attacked the children with a hatchet, killing both of them. He then ignited gasoline that had been spread throughout the house, triggering an explosion that killed him as well. The fire consumed the structure within minutes. When firefighters and police arrived, there was nothing to save. The violence was complete. The escalation everyone had feared had finally occurred, not because warnings were absent, but because none of them had been actionable in time. The aftermath was suffocating. Susan's parents, who had spent more than 2 years fighting for answers, now faced a loss that defied language. Their grandchildren were dead. The man they believed responsible for their daughter's disappearance had taken his own life. Any possibility of confession, of location, of truth had been burned away. Authorities moved quickly to explain procedures, to outline policies, to express regret. Reviews were ordered. Reports acknowledged missed opportunities, but stopped short of admitting systemic failure. The distinction felt academic in the face of such finality. In the days that followed, the question what else could have been done echoed through public discourse. It was not an abstract inquiry. It was an accusation aimed at a structure that requires certainty before action, even when uncertainty itself is dangerous. Susan Powell's case had begun with a quiet disappearance. It now ended in public horror, and between those points lay years of evidence that felt obvious only after it was too late to matter. In the days after the fire in Graham, Washington, the Susan Powell case collapsed inward, no longer an investigation, but an autopsy of failure. The deaths of Charlie and Braden were immediate, undeniable, and documented in the most brutal way possible. Susan's death, by contrast, remained theoretical, accepted by reason, unprovable by law. Josh Powell had taken with him not only his own life, but the last living link to what happened on the night his wife disappeared. Law enforcement searched the charred remains of the house with grim clarity of purpose. They were not looking for survivors. They were looking for meaning. Gasoline cans were found. The layout of the fire confirmed premeditation. This was not a spontaneous act. It was planned, prepared, and executed with finality. In that sense, it echoed everything investigators had suspected about Susan's disappearance: calculation, control, and a determination to leave nothing behind. What followed was a sequence of reviews, inquiries, and reports, each written in the careful language of institutions trying to explain themselves. Child Protective Services acknowledged misjudgments. Police agencies outlined the limits of their authority. Courts reiterated the constraints imposed by evidence standards and parental rights. None of it felt sufficient. The explanations were accurate, and still they failed to answer the only question that mattered to the public and to Susan's family. How could this have been allowed to happen? The answer, if there was one, lay not in a single error, but in accumulation. Each warning sign had been real, but isolated. Each decision had been defensible on its own. Together, they formed a path that led directly to catastrophe. The system had not been blind. It had been cautious, and caution, in this case, proved lethal. Susan's parents returned again and again to her journals. After the fire, they were no longer just evidence of fear. They were artifacts of foresight. She had anticipated disbelief. She had worried that her concerns would be minimized. She had tried to leave a record that would survive her. That record did survive, but it did not protect her. The cruelty of that outcome is difficult to overstate. Susan had done what society tells threatened people to do: document, disclose, seek help. The response she received was procedural sympathy and structural paralysis. With Josh dead, prosecutors formally closed the criminal case. There would be no trial, no verdict, no official narrative beyond probable cause statements and investigative summaries. Susan Powell would remain legally missing, her cause of death undetermined. The absence of her body continued to exert power even after everything else had been resolved by violence. It was as if the crime itself refused to be named. Public reaction shifted from shock to anger. Media coverage intensified, not around mystery, but around accountability. The case became a reference point in debates about domestic violence, coercive control, and the limits of child protection systems. Experts dissected the warning signs that had been present for years. Advocates argued for earlier intervention, for treating patterns of control and intimidation as predictors rather than background noise. Yet, even as lessons were extracted, there was a sense of futility. Policy changes move slowly. Cultural understanding evolves unevenly, and Susan Powell's case resisted neat moral framing. It was not a story of ignorance. It was a story of knowledge without authority, of insight without enforcement. The children's deaths forced a reframing of Susan's disappearance. For years, the tragedy had been suspended, unresolved. Now it had an ending so violent that it retroactively clarified everything that came before. Josh Powell had demonstrated, beyond any remaining doubt, what he was capable of. In doing so, he confirmed what Susan had feared and what investigators had long suspected. The confirmation arrived at the highest possible cost. For Susan's parents, grief took on a layered form. They mourned their daughter, still unfound. They mourned their grandchildren, brutally killed. And they mourned the truth itself, now unreachable. There would be no recovery, no burial, no final accounting. Closure, a word often offered too casually, had no meaning here. In the years that followed, memorials were held, documentaries produced, books written. Susan Powell's name entered the lexicon of true crime, not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a warning to be heeded. Her case illustrated the danger of waiting for certainty in situations defined by control and fear. It showed how abusers can exploit legal restraint, how the absence of a single piece of evidence can neutralize an entire pattern of behavior. And yet, even as the case became emblematic, it remained deeply personal. Susan was not a symbol to those who loved her. She was a woman who laughed, who worked, who worried about her children's future. Charlie and Braden were not cautionary tales. They were boys who deserved safety and did not receive it. The final injustice of the Susan Powell case is not only that a murderer escaped trial or that 2 children died under supervision meant to protect them. It is that the truth was visible in fragments for years and still could not be assembled in time to matter. The system did what it was designed to do. What it was designed to do, in this case, was not enough. Susan Powell disappeared quietly. The world learned her name loudly. Between those two moments lies a lesson that remains unresolved. How many warnings are required before belief becomes action? And how many lives must be lost before restraint is recognized as its own form of harm?